I am Anne. Welcome back to my channel. Today we are going to discuss Jules Verne and zombies. Jules Verne was this author that was born in the 1820s and then he died right at the end of the Victorian era in 1905. He wrote so many books that are considered to be science fiction classics. A good example is 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, Around the World in 80 Days, The Mysterious Island, Journey to the Center of the Earth. I could go on and on. He was a very prolific writer. Near the end of his life, he wrote this book that was called The Castle in Transylvania. And I had never heard of this book. I have been a great fan of Jules Verne since I was in high school. I'm pretty sure the only book I was required to read was 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, but after I read that and just adored it so much, I even wrote a weird fan fiction about it. After I read that book, I just loved his writing so much. I absorbed as many of his books as I could. I'm pretty sure there was only like one book that I read that I didn't really like. It was something having to do with the Amazon River. And I don't remember that one that much. But that one I didn't like, but everything else he writes is amazing. Most of his books have to do with experimental science or advancements in science. For example, in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, submarines were just starting to be invented around the 1860s, I believe, where he published that first book. And because of that, he wrote about what he believed submarines would look like. Because of that, he's most commonly associated with science books as well as more realistic books. So when I spotted this book, which is literally called Castle in Transylvania, it was published, I believe, just a couple years before Dracula was published by Bram Stoker, and I've read some articles that said that possibly Bram Stoker was inspired to write Dracula by this book, but is that accurate? I'm not sure. It seems pretty likely after reading this, but it's definitely a book that is very starts off very differently than most of Jules Verne's books, because most of his books are more scientific adventures, whereas this one feels much more of a gothic horror. The original title is The Castle of the Carpathians, and that title I feel is much more fitting than The Castle in Transylvania. I believe that title was changed following the release of Dracula just because the association might increase sales of this one. I mean, I certainly picked it up because I saw Castle in Transylvania and immediately I thought of vampires. However, the cover of this book actually says it is the first zombie story, which intrigued me even more. I'm going to talk a little bit about what the book is basically about, what I liked and didn't like about it, and then we're going to get into full spoilers, but I'm going to have timestamps, so if you want to read this book, I don't want to spoil anything for you just in case. So this book is only 220 pages or so it's a pretty quick read. Basically, it follows this town, which has this castle far away, and this castle is known as the Castle of the Carpathians. And the latest owner, Baron Rudolf von Gortz, vanished. Nobody knows where he is, but the villagers just continue living. The castle is now completely abandoned, but they take it that, like, no one's living here. It's fine. That is until this shepherd, who is known for having very good eyesight, he decides to buy a spyglass from a peddler that is going through town. And he sees smoke rising from the castle. He, of course, alerts everyone in the town, and they're all like, wait, is somebody up there? They believe it might be the devil, as they call him. So the doctor in town, who is not really a doctor, they called him a doctor. Although he was accepted as one, he had had no training, not in medicine, not in dispersing drugs, not in anything. He was simply a former quarantine attendant. So yes, that tells you about the level of science in this town. And then he goes with a forester who's engaged to the wealthiest man's in town daughter, Nick. So they too travel up to the castle. They end up getting kind of attacked by an unseen force. They're there at night. They can't get into the castle. They hear these strange voices and come running down. And so it's a mystery of like, what's going on in this castle? Are there undead, demons, ghosts, vampires? Who knows? There's all these superstitions going around the town, and of course the townspeople are so terrified they won't do anything. So I would say that's the first like quarter to half of the book. It's a short book, I told you, and I don't think that's giving away any spoilers. So this book definitely does not go in the place that I was expecting. I was expecting it to go two ways, and I'll tell you at the end in the spoiler section which way it goes. The first one is it has a more rational explanation to things that are going on. For example, Rudolph the Baron, maybe he just returned and like everything's normal, they're just like cray-cray, and it's all about superstition in the town, and they're not very scientific based. The other one is that yes, there's something actually supernatural going on. When it talked about this is the first zombie story, I assumed that, yeah, there's going to be zombies. There's going to be a supernatural explanation for what's going on, like in Dracula. Now let's get to my likes and dislikes for this book, non-spoiler for now. The main theme I think that's discussed in this book is the separation between the scientific mind and the, I guess, superstitious mind. In that case, they tend to look at rural people, look down on them almost as being very superstitious, not scientific. I think that is rather unfair to paint everyone like that. Even the doctor, as I pointed out, he's not even a real doctor. So none of these people have a scientific or educated background. So Jules Verne is definitely looking down on uneducated people, which makes sense with Jules Verne himself because he has this intense interest in science, and maybe there are real experiences he's had with more country villagers where they tend to be more superstitious, whereas like more educated scientific individuals tend to be very cynical of, yeah, this probably has a probable actual explanation. It's not just like ghosts or demons. So that was one of my favorite things that was examined in this book, is this idea that a lot of people assume it's something scary, something unexplainable, when it could be something very easily explainable. The main thing that I struggled with, which is the one thing I think I struggle with in all Jules Verne's books, is he tends to focus a lot on heavy description. And in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, he spends a lot of time examining like oceanic life and technology and things like that, which is really interesting for what it is. But because this book takes place in a small village and in a castle, most of the descriptions are not half as fascinating as like deep scientific explanations or places, different places around the world. In Around the World in 80 Days, you have different descriptions of just how different the world looks around the world. Whereas in this one, you're kind of just like stuck in this like small town and small castle, and you get a lot of descriptions of like random rooms and random houses, and I honestly didn't care too much about that. However, what is done really good is the ominous feeling. You're not really sure, as I talked about, you're not really sure whether this is supernatural or it has an actual reasonable explanation. You constantly have an ominous feel that something's going on that's weird in this place, but you don't know what. And so that unknown is quite creepy. And the way he describes the rooms and the castle is very disturbing. And I loved how he did that, but it got really heavy on the description at times. Now, let's get to spoilers. So what is going on? So Nick and the doctor get back down. They've been hurt, but they're alive and fine, and everyone refuses to go back to the castle. Now there's this guy, Count Franz of Telek, and his soldier come into town. They are taking, I guess, a tour around the country. He is a Romanian count, very wealthy. His parents died when he was younger, and he's just been touring the world. He hears the story of the castle and the missing baron who vanished years ago, and all the smoke that has been seen, and something's going on there. So he tells the story of his experiences with this Baron Rudolph, who owns the castle. And turns out in Vienna years ago, I believe 5 years ago, Franz fell in love with this beautiful singer, Listilla. She was breathtaking, and her number one admirer was, dun dun dun, Baron Rudolph himself. He would just watch her every single show, but from behind this, like a screen. So he can see out at her, but she can't see him. And she is really creeped out by him. And so because Franz is super in love with her, he proposes to her. She actually says yes to him, and she decides to leave the stage. However, at her last performance, the screen is put down, and Baron Rudolph shows his face, and she must be traumatized by how ugly he is, and her heart literally bursts and she dies on stage. Yes, that is how the scene goes. And of course, Franz is devastated. He starts grieving for a long time, and Baron Rudolph just disappears from society permanently. And now years later, Franz is very curious, like, what's going on in this castle, and is it related to this Baron Rudolph as well as my love Lustilla? So he goes with a soldier up to the castle. He ends up hearing the voice of his beloved and seeing her in the window. And he's like, oh my gosh, she somehow survived, and this Baron is holding her captive. So he sneaks into the castle where he is imprisoned by something. He's in this like crypt. They bring him like food and water for like a couple days. He ends up escaping and learning the truth of what is going on in this castle. So there was this scientist, Orphanik, who Baron Rudolph met in Venice, I believe. And Orphanik was a scientist, but he was looked down on by most other scientists, so they didn't really take his work seriously. So he couldn't get any financing to do any of his research in scientific matters. Baron Rudolph is very interested in what he is researching and decides to become his patron, so he pays for his research. And he is researching things like a phonograph, which fits with, the Jules Verne pulling from real science, because phonographs were being researched during that time. He also figures out how to project a small picture onto a mirror and move it slightly to make it look as if that picture is moving. So it's an early form, I suppose, of motion picture. He does that to Lustilla's picture, and that is how she is seen in the castle. And of course, the phonograph, he recorded her voice before she died, and so when he plays her last song over and over again, it is because he has that on a phonograph. So the reality is there's no zombies. The Baron did not want anyone to find out about him living there, which, okay, because he owns the place, I don't see why people would think that was weird. So he sabotaged and tried to scare Nick and the doctor away early on when they came up to the castle. He tries to imprison Franz, and then they have plans to blow up the castle and then escape into the night. Of course, the phonograph ends up getting destroyed, and Baron Rudolph, realizing that he can't live without his beautiful Lustilla's voice, he jumps into the rubble of the castle as it comes plowing down, and it kills him. And Franz makes it out alive, but he realizes that Lustilla is not alive. She was not a zombie. But this book was intriguing. I read it because I wanted to read some Halloween classics, and if this indeed did inspire Dracula. And you can definitely see the ominous setting, Franz coming to this creepy castle and being imprisoned in there, where he knows that there's a host and possibly other people there. You can see a lot of elements from Dracula in this book. It's a very interesting book. It's a quick read. It's definitely not up there for me with a lot of Jules Verne books. I ended up giving this 4 out of 5 stars. I enjoyed it, especially since it was so short, but I do think part of the reason that I didn't like it is because it didn't reach my expectations. There's no zombies involved, especially for being called like the first zombie story. There's no zombies. There is a reasonable explanation for what's going on. It's more like a Scooby-Doo episode. So that was a little bit anticlimactic for me when I was expecting it to be much more supernatural. I also think it would have better been called The Castle of the Carpathians as opposed to The Castle in Transylvania, simply because nowadays Transylvania has associations with vampires. So when I picked up this book, I thought it was going to be about vampires, and then I was like, well, maybe it's about zombies, and then it didn't turn out to be about either, and I was a little bit disappointed, especially if I went into this book without those expectations. I think I would have enjoyed it a lot more. I'm curious to see if you've even heard of this book. Have you read any other Jules Verne? What are some great classics that are lesser known that are great to read around Halloween? I'm always looking for more like horror classics, but I feel like there's a lot of the popular ones And those are the only ones I ever hear about. So I'm curious if you know like some lesser known classic horror novels. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you liked it, like, subscribe. I post every Saturday at 6 p.m. Eastern time. And I will see you all in the next video. Bye!